Thanks, Rick. I was sitting down, so I didn't get to see before. How many people in the audience would self-identify as being a designer in their background? Handful or just reluctant? How many would self-identify as being as a developer? Roughly on par. And what about a hybrid of the two in your day-to-day work? Awesome, that's my people. It's this intersection that really excites me, and this talk is aimed at the journey that we've been on to improve collaboration between the design and development functions at Seek. And I didn't say that at the outset, I work at Seek. And yeah, so without further ado, I'll get into it. So conversations that take place between designers and developers more often than not focus on the pixels that we're putting on the screen rather than the principles that underpin the design itself. Excuse me. Wireframes are still, unfortunately, the most common form of discussion point when we're talking about crossing this boundary between design and development. And I say unfortunate because they're only sharing part of the story. They're sharing the design team's computed output rather than all the very detailed principled design process that happens behind closed doors. In my opinion, this model is fundamentally broken. And the reason for that is we spend far too much time in the development time of building our products, reverse engineering these marked up pictures, having to be mindful of so many concerns like, am I using semantic markup? Is my solution accessible? And filling in any responsive gaps that fall between the boundaries of the wireframes that we received. There's simply too much risk to leave to the build time of our applications. And the most unfortunate thing is that's arriving in front of our users in the form of an inconsistent user experience as they navigate across our product boundaries and our team boundaries. So what if we stopped focusing on the wireframes as being the contracts between our design and development functions and instead spent a little bit more time focusing on the language that we're using when communicating design requirements? If we could define a language, would we specify something like this as the language that we're using, where we're combining structure, design, and behavior all at build time, and the chance for something to go wrong is really high and caught relatively late in the process? Or alternatively, we could strive for a more declarative and compositional angle and instead write our code a little bit cleaner like this, but the main thing being that we're now encapsulating all of those concerns, the structure, the behavior, etc., all in something called an email field instead of having to wire up everything bespoke each time we author a new field. And it's these encapsulated principles that are allowing us to drive consistency through our applications and ultimately enable any of our solutions to go a lot further through our products. So it's no secret that we can do this today using something like components, but in order to do that, we need to start seeing components as more than simply buttons and fields on a form. Rather see them as an opportunity to encapsulate our design team's intent in these little reusable pieces that we can recombine to build our products. So we've been on this journey for a couple of years now at Seek to redefine how we're collaborating across this boundary, breaking down what were previously more knowledge silos around our design and development functions and distilling as much of that knowledge into the code as possible. And what we've found is that the solutions that we're coming up with as a cross-cutting guild is enabling the solution to go a lot further through our products. In order to do this, we had to first peel back the pixel translation layer that was happening through the wireframes and the requirements gathering. And that was forming the basis of all of our communication. So we really had to revisit this. And in order to do that, we listened to what the teams were discussing and where were the pain points when we had a designer and developer sitting around a screen. What were they trying to fix? Surely something wasn't working if they were complaining or pixel nudging an individual interface. And it all came down to spacing between elements and text. And given something like text and typography is so critical to the success of any design, we figured that was the most sensible spot to start with our new language in our component library. I'll get you to consider that text component there, which has the content of my heading. And we'll take you on the journey through how we defined this little slice of our language through developing this components interface. So you'll have to indulge me. I'm going to run through a little bit of code, but hopefully the message still lands. So we'll go about adding a heading modifier to this text component. And in the old world, what we would have received from our design team is a specification, something like this. Our heading text is 21 pixels, and I want it to run over a 27 pixel line height. And the only reason that we know those pixel values is because this wireframing process that we've been doing for years and years has trained designers to translate all their amazing work into pixels to cross that boundary to development. So instead of providing this pixel value for font size, how would we best understand what goes into arriving at that value? So a heading is only one element within a typographic hierarchy, and it's not the pixel value at the end of the day that matters, it's the scale between the other elements within that hierarchy. And so if we weren't compiling these down to pixels, so that is a little bit small on that one, but it's okay on that one. If we weren't compiling these down to pixels, what we could see was the design team was working off a base font size of 10 pixels. Every element in the hierarchy, it was really the scale that they cared about. So in this case, the heading is a 2.1 scale. So if we express that in our CSS as a sum of the scale times font size, that's very important. So I'll come back to that shortly. And so the same with line height now. Instead of just plugging in this 27 pixel values, we want to understand how they arrived at that. And as with any principled and structured design system, all vertical spacing should always be specified in terms of grid rows. So that's no different for line height. We're used to using this for things like our patterns and our margins, but we don't often flow it through properties like line height. So in our case, the row height was set to 9 pixels. So what we were really after was a heading having a row span of 3. So if we captured that as a calculation here, what we're starting to see emerging are some lower level design principles around the base font size and row height, but then a really clean specification around how we define a heading within our system. So rather than the previous pixel specification, we can now refer to a heading as a 2.1 scale running over 3 grid rows. But when we load it in the browser, it looks drastically different on the left to what the design team was expecting on the right. And the reason is that CSS thinks that it understands design, and it gives us these properties like line height, but then treats them drastically different to what the design or typography in the design sense really means when it talks about line height. So here we see that CSS vertically centers that text within the specified 3 grid rows. While in the typographic sense, that line height is measured from the baseline of the text. So you can see that drastically different treatment of white space is going to result in a whole lot of nudging in our designs. And identifying this as the root cause meant that we could now address this at a language and component level, solve this once centrally, and have it flow through all of our teams. So that's what we went about doing. We wanted the language to remain simple. We wanted to ask for something like a heading and not have every team have to pixel nudge. So what we had to do in this case to solve our heading issue was move the heading downwards. Now I'll cruise through this. If you're keen to go into it in a bit more detail, I can, but I don't think this is the forum for it. So we want to move the heading down, and we need to move it down to the true baseline, and that's by a factor of 2 parts. So the first part highlighted in blue here is the height of the descender, so that G hanging down below the baseline there. That's not available to us in CSS, so we had to go about manually calculating that in pixels, which is not moving on your screen. So I'll do this one. So by moving this line up, I can see that 3 pixels is the height of the descender. So by storing that in a variable, we can then return to our heading and see that the second part of that distance that we need to travel, in blue here, is that leftover distance between the line height and the font size. So by taking half of that difference, which again happens to be 3 pixels, we can store that as a line height offset. And when we add that to the descender height, we ultimately end up with a single heading offset that we can apply as a transform. So it sounds a little bit technical, but if we can do this in such a centralized manner, we can solve what is quite a fundamental design discrepancy. So there we are. The heading's now sitting where it should on its true baseline. Now, the reason for using a CSS transform, for those curious, we don't want to push neighboring elements away. We just want to shift the text to align with the design principles. And we want to preserve things like paddings and margins for proper semantic use at a later date. Now, what happens with subheadings? Do we really need to go through all that process again? It can be quite heavy-handed. And in our case, we're using the same font across headings and subheadings, so it'd be great if we could just specify the height of the descender as a scale using something like munits, which is a perfect use case. So instead, if I return to my calculator and calculate this by m values, you can see the number is much, much smaller. But if I come up by a factor of 0.15, which sounds super technical, but it's just saying that the height of the descender for the Roboto font is 15%. So that now means that I can apply this as a scale to both my heading and my subheading and not need to do this for every element within the hierarchy. However, to calculate the rest of the transform as a scale, it does get a bit more technical. If you're curious, I've got an open source library that does this, but I won't go into that today. So the idea being we take in all of these design principles we've just spoken about that define our text, and what we get are the CSS rules required to meet the design team's expectations. So example usage, this happens to use a preprocessor, so less at the moment, pulling in the mixing and passing it all of our heading attributes, our Roboto descender scale, and then the lower level row height and base font size. But importantly, what we get back is the font size and line height properties, and a scaled transform to sit the text on baseline. You might think that these are the exact same values we started with, so why did we bother doing all of that effort? The fundamental difference here is we now have calculated properties that are coming out of the system. So that frees up our design team to not have to go back to their tooling and generate these pixel values to then tell the developers what to plug into a CSS sheet and have it rot somewhere. Now go back and define a subheading as a 1.8 scale over 3 rows. We can define our standard text as being 1.4 over 2 rows. So the language is now focused on the principles rather than having to constantly be translating to and from pixels. So over time, our hierarchy has continued to grow as we've found use cases for other elements. Now you can't quite see the grid there, but our discussions now when we introduce new elements is again no longer about pixels, but we can define how many rows we want our text to run over. We can define what scale we want the text to be in terms of the hierarchy, and we could even change the font, and it's always going to sit on baseline. So the importance of this is that we are no longer having to do the translation, that we've removed that whole layer from our discussion. And it's drastically reduced the speccing time for our design team, having to constantly be on the back of any question from a developer, having to go back to their design tool, calculate a pixel value, and then come back only to find out there's another question. It's also reduced the number of instances where we're pairing around a machine trying to pixel nudge things to marry up with a wireframe. So all of this looks a little bit foreign to us now, not having to do that work. So if we revisit what we saw earlier, a simple card component containing a heading and a subheading, that's now a reality for us, and we can trust that it will always, again, you can't see the grid there, sorry, the contrast is not great, and it will always be on grid as the designer expected with little effort. So that's a deep dive of what we did to achieve parity between our text component and the design team's expectations. I want to talk a little bit more about the interface around these components. So what you saw in the heading and subheading modifiers on those components, that is the beginnings of our design language. So as we add more configurations and more options to these suite of components, it's important that we take a bit of time to step back and really bike shed the naming conventions that we use on these things, because it's going to form the language that we have going forward. One day we had someone come and ask us, can we add green as a modifier to the text component? Because they wanted to have some kind of successful message registered successfully. Couldn't just go and plug that into the text component, because that wouldn't have scaled going forward. We quickly realized that green is to the color property what pixels was to the font size. It was merely the desired end state that we wanted to see on the screen, but what we really needed to do was unpack the why. What was the purpose for the green text, regardless of its inaccessibility? So the challenge was to go back to the team and work out what the intent was for that messaging. And in our case, it came down to the tone. And in this particular case, and for all the other cases we found, it was a positive message. It was something that we wanted to reaffirm the users that they'd done something right. And so by capturing it as positive within our language, we've now introduced something that will scale. And if we choose to come up with a slightly more accessible design for positive messaging, we can do that centrally, and it will scale through our system without having to go and touch every single instance of every component through our products. So one of the best side effects of this journey is the increased collaboration between design and development. We're having great discussions a lot earlier in the piece rather than capturing them around a dev screen at the end of our journey. And often we find solutions, just like we saw with the green text, has a much broader reach across multiple products. While it may seem heavy-handed, I've been asked, is pixel perfect really necessary? And it's not about the pixels. It's about the confidence you have with building with a system like this. You can have your design team have a verbal conversation with the development team and know that the output is going to be exactly as if they'd printed a screen out of their design tooling. And you can have developers feeling empowered that they don't need to constantly be getting their work reviewed. So long as they use all the boundaries within the system, it will meet the expectations. Massive increase in efficiency by reducing the redundant conversations and focusing on just maturing this language across multiple teams. And ultimately, that user experience that I spoke about trading off at the beginning of the talk is a much more consistent experience across multiple product teams. So where are we now? That's not even a fifth of the components we have. The list keeps growing every day. We keep finding newer components that we can pull out and model smaller and smaller principles. But we are now delivering across, that's the site. I don't know if this is gonna, hang on, I need to change monitors. Cool, so you can see that. So no surprise, everything's on grid and pixel perfect as I was professing. And it doesn't matter how many times or how many pages we navigate across, no matter how fluid the animations, everything is perfectly on grid in every aspect of the site because everyone's building off the same system. So if we reflect on the journey and think about what's worked, definitely components everywhere. Oh, I'll turn that baseline off now. It's gonna. Definitely components everywhere. There's no concept too small that can't be modeled in a component, and the lower that we find the, what's the word? The lower the concept that we find, the more we can recompose it in larger solutions later on. And the cross-discipline pairing's been awesome. We've had developers really skill up in the design space, and vice versa. Designers are seeing some of the constraints that developers have to operate within. So that's been really positive. What takes work, and it has for this whole journey, and it continues to today, naming is hard. We know that in software, it's one of the hardest things you can do. But when you're really putting it front and center by defining a language, it's really critical to get it right from the outset to really drive solid adoption across the teams. Secondly, justifying the why can be quite difficult. A lot of the times we want to design with our hearts, not our minds. And when you've got quite a technical design system in place, it can take a little bit of time to get to the why. We haven't found something that wasn't justifiable yet, but it just takes a bit of digging. So yeah, that's an ongoing challenge for everyone. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, our journey is open source. We've got our Seek style guide on GitHub, so feel free to jump in and have a look around if that's your thing. But hopefully I've inspired you to help define your own team's design language and reflect on how you collaborate across this historic divide of design and development to deliver better user experiences. But that's me. Thank you.